Welcome to What Would Jesus Tech, a podcast where a theologian and an engineer apply the texts of Scripture to the technologies of today. Today we consider our digital possessions, our physical possessions, and how we keep them secure in light of the fact that we have a God who keeps us secure. How do we think about them, and how do we do passwords well? How do we do logging in websites well? Do we use LastPass? Do we have encryption? What are the actual tools and tips that we need, and how do we think about this stuff more deeply? Just before we jump into the episode today, I do want to thank our Patreon supporters. It's been kind of cool to be like, hey, there are some people out there who want to support us financially, and that's has enabled us to kind of improve some of our recording software and things like that. So just thank you to that, and thank you to everyone who's listening as well. It's been a fun journey. We're beyond a year now, and there's no end in sight. So thank you. All right, Joel, you work at a security company. You know this stuff inside and out. So let's dive right in with just understanding, why is this topic even important in the first place?
Yeah, I think so. For reference, I work at a company called Splunk. It's a data analytics platform. Part of their business comes from enterprise security, which is a whole, world to talk about. It's like the digital security side, and like we kind of mentioned LastPass, and like when you see that like passwords got leaked online and all of those things, that's like the digital security world. And I think security is also maybe more important or more top of mind recently because, there is a war happening right now, right? And as part of this physical war, there's cyber warfare, which is like digital warfare also. So there's an elevated sense of, and at the government level at least, of like critical infrastructure, like what could happen there. And then even for like individuals, there are, security to your property, right? Your personal property. Should you have more protection because you feel concerned about the environment you're in? What about fakes and the rise of phishing calls and scams, which I don't know, at least personally, I felt has been constantly increasing. Like I get way more scam calls now than I ever before. And I'm like, should I even change my number? Does that do anything? Or is it just like, no matter what number you have, you'll eventually get on these lists? So
well, even my mom the other day, she posted something on Facebook. She had a friend reach out to her first who said, hey, I saw someone else with your picture and name add me onto Facebook. Have you created a new account? And so it was kind of like a digital identity theft question of my own mom. And then she posted something on Facebook just about, hey, just be careful. I think someone's trying to hack or copy my account or something to that effect. And then she got because she made it a worldwide post on Facebook. And then she had a whole bunch of these comments saying, hey, reach out to so-and-so on Instagram. I really trust them. And wow. So it's a very smart, and there's like 4 or 5 of these comments, not related to my mom in any way, like not a friend. But because she posted it publicly, if you post anything online about a hack right now, what the scammers are smart enough to do now is to say, hey, like, I'm not a fishy person. I'm safe. Facebook, don't kick me off. I'm not doing anything against the terms of service of Facebook. All I'm doing is suggesting that I trust this person on Instagram. Now, that person on Instagram, they haven't posted a thing at all other than pictures of like fake pictures of a family or whatever. And so the goal is that these hackers want you to meet that person on Instagram and then obviously go down the road of eventually giving up your money. And the way that they always try to do that is through gift cards, or almost always. Sometimes they like send money to our bank account and you will somehow get out of this, but they try not to do that because then they can be tracked. So it's normally gift cards so that they can't be tracked. But yeah, so these scams happen, and my mom was not a victim to it because she was smart enough to not follow those links, and she deleted those comments after we talked on the phone. But yeah, like I definitely think with the rise of AI technology in the hands of evil people in the world, and I'll just say it as it is, there are evil people in the world, even if there's tons of well-meaning people made in the image of God, and everyone's made in the image of God. Still, sin is real. And there's people out there who are trying to access your information and that sort of thing.
I think it's sad almost that like a lot of the people who fall prey to scams are typically older, or at least that you see on like the YouTube videos. They're always targeting these people who are less familiar with technology, and that they're more likely to get duped because they can't tell, the subtle nuances that can push you to be like, this is fishy, this is suspect, from this is genuine. And it's interesting that maybe that age where you feel like you're a digital native is going to start dropping, as you're mentioning, with AI, because it gets a little bit more harder to tell, right? And I mean, like, I actually surprisingly had an example this week. I got a phone call, and it was a real person. Usually I get a phone call and it's like a pre-recorded message, and I instantly hang up.
Those are like, easy.
So yeah, those are easy, right? So I got a phone call, and it was actually a person, and he said, this guy calling from Coinbase. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, Coinbase, crypto. I was like, okay. And he's like, yeah, like, we detected unusual activity from Colombia on your account. And I was like, okay, sure. And I started talking to him, and I could hear people in the background. There was some background noise, which I didn't think of too much at first. And then slowly I was like, okay, like, can you validate some of my information? I mean, they must have had my email. They had my phone number. Obviously, they called me. But yeah, I was like, this doesn't sound legitimate. And he's like, oh, okay, like, then you'll just call us back. And then he like hung up. And I was like, oh my gosh, was that someone trying to scam me?
100%.
To get my like account access or something like that, And it's crazy.
So the current context is that these things are going to rise. There's with AI now, it is easier. Like, I even told my parents this. It's like, it is possible now for someone to take the recordings of our podcast, use the audio files there in order to create an AI replica of my voice that therefore could be used to fake, hey, mom and dad, I'm in need. Like, this stuff.
Oh yeah.
It's changing now, right? We need to be ready for it. And everybody likes to talk about the positives of AI, but, or some people don't. Some people are all fear and some people are all hope. And it's like, let's just be realistic about this stuff. Yeah. But let's unveil the curtain, if you will, of how security works then in an online age. Like, we want to protect our emails, our pictures of our children. We want to, it'd be foolish not to have a password, or we all know it's foolish to have your password be password, right? Yeah. And I don't think we should just do a simplistic, how do you make a good password? Because people can just Google that and like, you make it complicated, hard to, all this stuff. Maybe we'll get into that briefly, but I really want us to understand how security works, to understand just what are the risks and how do we assess risks in creating passwords. So help us with that.
I mean, yeah, let's use the password example and go down this kind of like digital cybersecurity kind of explainer. So, I mean, as you mentioned, you don't pick a simple password. You pick something with numbers, something with special characters, and not a common order. Like, even using words is not recommended. And the reason for all of this advice comes down to one attack vector, which is really brute force attacking. So, in an age where computers are getting more powerful, you could just keep trying different passwords until, let's say, after a week, like a couple weeks, it finally matches with the right password. And it will go through common passwords first. It will go through the dictionary first. So there's a smart way to try and guess your password if you use a common word.
And that's not a human sitting down typing it out. That's a computer algorithm that runs on a computer.
Algorithm. Yeah. So, I mean, that was obviously like a big wave that happened. And then, security is really like an arms race. So I think like the next thing that we saw is that, hey, if you're trying to log in incorrectly 5 times, we're going to lock out your account. Right. So that's going to stop brute force. It still isn't like, well, someone can come back and keep trying that every so often. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's not like a perpetual stop, but at least stop this, like, we're just going to brute force everything continually. Right. So that was an interesting thing. But let's say you're a real person and you do enter your password wrong too many times, which has happened to me, and my account gets logged out or locked out. what happens is there is something at these companies. Let's say it was a bank that I was trying to lock into. They have something called a security operations center, or a SOC is what it's called in the cybersecurity world. And they will see a notification to be like, user so and so has been logged out from bad password attempts. And they don't know if that's me or if that's like a, hacker. And then they'll look into the details. They'll use this application. It's called a SIEM, Security Information and Event Management. And basically that just like captures all the details around what happened. So it says, oh, the IP address is coming from this overseas unusual place, when we know typically we're expecting someone in Toronto, right? So they'll start doing some investigating analysis, and then they can flag it as fishy. And that's how you get into like fraud and all of those type of things. So these people sitting in the SOC, there are people hired at every company who focus on, doing this type of work. So definitely, hats out to them. It's like we get free security that we're not paying for, that these companies that we're entrusting are paying for, which is why it's also important to work with a reputable company, a reputable bank, because they will have more of these things in place, right?
So that's why it's helpful to go with recognizable brands when you're doing different things. Yeah, you might not like, going through Google as a password, as your email, and be like, oh, I'm going to use this upstart, like this new company, because they might be better as an email provider. And sure, there might be benefits there, and they might like have great security. It's just that the smaller, the newer the company, the less likely they are to like really build up that infrastructure of IT. That I remember feeling the negative side of this working at the software company I was at, trying to sell. I'd have the customer, like Scotiabank customer. I got Scotiabank, one of the largest banks in Canada, to sign up for our product Plum. But then I had to go through this grueling security assessment, because they're like, you're a smaller company. You only have 35 full-time staff. We need to really see if your security is up to our level as a bank. And yeah, like I think that's good that these companies do that. They have that rigor. But fundamentally, there's a question of risk. Sometimes Scotiabank would be like, you need to offer all of this advanced, like we offer encryption, we offer this, we offer multi-factor sign-on, all these best standards. But then, yeah, there's always more you could do. Like in the same way that your house, your physical house, could have security cameras, it could have laser beams on the floor that you go over. Oh, you trigger the laser beam and it shoots a dart out from the wall, and boom, like, you're out. Yeah. Like you can have all that stuff, but what is actually necessary and what is not? And in the context of this arms race, it's very hard to determine. You can never have absolute security. You can never, and there's extremes here, right? But it's great that these larger companies have this stuff in place.
Yeah, so I think that's a good thing to kind of like talk through, is like, what do you recommend is like the risk level people should be comfortable with? And I think, the easy thing to say out flat is like, it depends. Obviously, it depends on what you're securing and who you are and all those type of things. And I think like in terms of like the house, like that you mentioned, right? It's like you could have cameras on the outside as like a deterrent, right? And then once they come inside, there's like other security measures you could have. You could have cameras on the inside, or like security enforcements and alarm system where people come, right? So there's like preventive security and then reactive security. And I think like that's a good, paradigm to start thinking about security in general. But then even on the preventive side, you can keep escalating. Like I could walk around with bodyguards. I could have a bodyguard posted right outside of the house, right? And I obviously don't have that. But for someone else, that actually might make sense, right? Depending on the threat level, how targeted they are. So I think it is a nuanced conversation, which also just makes it more complicated, because everyone just wants an answer. Everyone just wants to know, like, tell me what to do.
Should I use LastPass, yes or no? And it's like, well, LastPass got hacked, and because they're one of the largest password providers, like you can read some of the stuff online that they admitted publicly. They're like, yeah, not only were they able to access our systems and see some of the infrastructure, but they hacked one of our employees' computers. Like, it was just wild that LastPass, even though they're for the most part, a reputable company. Like I had a friend who asked me a year ago to like, hey, are they good? I'm going to go with them. And I'm like, yeah, like they're good. Like they're not huge, but they're large enough with enough venture capital behind them that I would expect them to have, and looking at their website. But yeah, so thinking about like just getting practical here, like, should you use Google Chrome to store all your passwords? The benefit is the convenience, obviously, and nobody can remember all the passwords they need to access all these different websites. So by storing it, whether it's LastPass or Google Chrome, it has that layer of efficiency, but it also ensures that you're not using the same password across multiple sites. And Google Chrome manages that. Now, the downside is someone steals your computer, then they steal access to everything. And that's why I would say having multi-factor sign-in is so important to turn on multiple accounts.
Yeah. I would say the same thing. I think like it's interesting because these tools like LastPass, Google Chrome, one password is another like really popular one. They do offer valuable tools and capabilities. Like they will do something where they will say, hey, we've checked leaked passwords and from other websites that have been hacked, and your password was on that list. So now if you're reusing that password anywhere, it's compromised. So in that brute force scenario I mentioned earlier, they will brute force compromised passwords faster because maybe people haven't changed them. So there's a higher likelihood they'll get in. So, they'll flag vulnerabilities. That's like a big part of security, is like checking vulnerabilities. Then the next aspect is like, instead of you putting in a password, they'll create a random password for you. So they'll go to the website, they will pre-fill in this random password, and like that's another layer you could use. But it all kind of comes back to, I think, MFA, which is what you mentioned, multi-factor authentication. That's super valuable. And I would say, yeah, like if I got a notification and I wasn't logging in somewhere to say, hey, is this really you logging in? That's like a very strong, second layer of defense to being breached. Which, yeah, I think I'm with you in saying MFA. It's annoying. It can be annoying, and like, Face ID and all these things like make it easier for sure. But it's still like, oh, I gotta like, it takes me like so long to like enter this website.
An extra 10 seconds.
Yeah, I'm like,
just think like 15 years ago, how slow the internet was. Just like compare it to that. Like you're going to lose some time. Maybe you won't have your whole world conveniently for you. I think doing that kind of stuff is essential. Doing that kind of multi-factor authentication and turning it on, and then that allows it. The other thing you can do is just to do like an annual audit of your passwords. So Google Chrome allows you to do this, and every website has this functionality. When you go into the settings, you go into security, you can see kind of like, oh, here are all the passwords, all 170 passwords that I'm using. And it's like, why do I need to still have accounts on these websites? And so you can go onto each of those. I've done this before. I've gone to those accounts, websites that I'm not using anything, and I've created passwords for, and it's like, delete all my data. Please delete all my data. And according to GDPR, they need to, which is the UK or European Union guidelines, they have to delete. You have a right to be forgotten, which is an interesting right that exists now. We never thought that with the rise of the internet, we'd need a right to be forgotten, but now that exists. It's a good protection. And we need more rights to protect from AI risk, but that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, so I think this is just helpful for people to think about it, even just having this conversation, it pop up on their podcast feed and just say, okay, maybe I need to do a security audit. Maybe I need to think through this kind of stuff.
Here's a twist, basically. Would Jesus use passwords, right? Like, what would Jesus tech? What do you think, like, the Bible has to say around security? I'm sure you mentioned it before. Obviously, security is something that is important. We're secure in Christ, but I feel like that's scratching the surface. I'm excited.
Yeah, because well, think about some of the New Testament passages that we have, like in Acts 2 or Acts 4, where it says they had everything in common, right? So in that context, like Acts 4:32, it says, no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. So the model of the early church is not personal protection of individual possessions. It is having everything in common. So what we actually should do is have a shared Facebook account, shared Twitter account, shared Gmail account, everything in common. Right, Joel? No. So
I thought you were going to ask me to share my bank account with you and we'll combine finances.
Okay, but I'm not even joking. On Sunday, I was invited to preach at a church, and so it was like a Serve Sunday. They were celebrating their volunteers. I was coming in to speak, so I went to Romans 12, which talks about some spiritual gifts and be like, use your spiritual gifts. But it also says you belong to one another. It says Christians belong to one another, and so there's a dependency that Christians have upon one another. That we like. How many passages are there about giving to the poor and taking care of one another? Like even Jesus, and this is sometimes quoted out of context, when Jesus is like, oh Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or need clothes? Like, when did that happen? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And we take that to think that's true of all poor people, but it's actually the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. So it's talking about the church. So
yeah, that's true.
We don't just care for people generally and alleviate poverty generally, though that's a good thing to do, of course. The church has especially the church in mind, that we need to care for our family members and relatives first, and then our church family next, and then the broader community. And those all come in tandem.
Actually, that's really encouraging, because I think I haven't heard that recently. It doesn't come to mind, but it's like, yeah, there are people at church that I can care for and help. And I may not even be thinking that because I'm like, oh, they're not poor. They're not struggling in poverty. Right. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be caring for them. Like you're mentioning Jesus saying.
Right. And I'm setting up this from, we need to consult the whole of scripture. The answer to the question, what would Jesus tech, is a question of who is Jesus and how did he live? And it's, what did Jesus say about himself? He is the fulfillment of the law. So he was the fulfillment of what the law and prophets promised. We unpack this in detail with Jess Gelstra on that episode about how Jesus is the embodiment of the law. He gives us an example of how to follow the law. So we need to take the Old Testament in mind too. And right in the 10 Commandments, you have the assumption of personal private property in the commandment, do not steal, right? And that's unpacked. Think about Exodus 22. It goes into detail, like whoever steals an ox or sheep or slaughters it and sells it, you steal someone else's thing. Well, you got to pay back 5 head of cattle for 1 ox, or 4 sheep for 1 sheep stolen. It's seen as this great offense to steal because you're impacting the economy of that other person while it's stolen, all this kind of stuff. So it's to truly do eye for an eye repayment, which is what the Old Testament talks about, then you gotta pay back even more than what you stole. And so this assumption of private property continues into the New Testament. And so, no, we do not need to share credit cards. We do not need to share all of our social accounts with one another, because there still is that assumption in the New Testament, of kind of private property that it is assumed, it kind of goes back to I'm going to give you this land. It even goes back to Genesis 1 of you need to rule the earth. So yes, everything in the earth is God's, but then God says, now it's yours. So it's both. So when you teach your kids to share, you say it's good to share, but let's say your kid is playing with Billy and Billy goes and steals a toy from your kid. What you should say is not, it's good to share. Let Billy have a turn. You should say, Billy stole. That's wrong, Billy. I'm sorry. Don't do that, Billy. That's not right. You're going to have to wait for your turn or whatever. Yes, we need to teach sharing, but we also need to teach individual property ownership under God's sovereign ownership of all things. And so what this looks like is kind of unpacked in the New Testament, and I can go there in a second.
Yeah, no, it's love and justice. And I think even me and my wife have discussed this a bunch, even between our 2 boys, right? It's sharing and having that heart of sharing and not worrying, but then also being okay, this is a line that is crossed, and there needs to be a lesson. So
Yeah, and think about what's assumed in this passage in Ephesians 4:28. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer. Okay, makes sense, repeat of Old Testament law. But they must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. So what's assumed there, like generosity can only come out of private property, right?
Right.
Like you could, like you're not generous if you're just taking from a pool and sharing with the pool. It needs to come out of your generous heart. And so there is this assumption of individual property in the New Testament is what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, it's really helpful. This is another tangent. I've like mentioned to my wife, it's like, it's hard for me to buy a gift now and feel like I'm really sacrificing because we have a joint bank account. So I'm like, you buying it for you, me buying it for you. Obviously it's a thought that matters. But when we had separate bank accounts, it to me felt more meaningful. And obviously there's a nuance there. We're married, two become one, etc. But I think between two like separate households, right? Rather than sharing resources, it means something more that I've worked and created whatever I have in my personal property, and then I come out and become generous out of that, right? I think that really is, just rephrasing what you're saying and totally makes sense.
Right. Yeah. You got to think about it as like these spheres, right? So there are things that are yours. And I think sometimes in marriage, we can abdicate our role as husbands by just kind of saying, oh, well, I'll let my wife decide. That's what real servant-hearted husband is just like kind of giving up on making decisions and not treating, the decisions with importance. So yeah, there is that need of thinking about the things we share as ours. That's one side of the coin, and the other side of the coin is some people exert their authority and they're way too domineering as a spouse, and so they need to chill.
So like obviously security, there's like so much. It's a huge topic. We didn't even talk about like malware and antivirus and all that.
Yeah, stuff. I'm getting distracted talking theology. Sorry, Joel.
It's good. There's even like in this conversation, I'm like, okay, but then what about like physical security? Like, should the husband be providing the wife security? Like, and then is there like anything there that I'm missing? Or is that maybe like a false expectation that like our society has put in? I know I'm putting you on the spot for all these crazy questions, but I kind of want to know.
No, it's a good question. Sometimes the answers to these questions are ways that pastors get canceled, right? Like John Piper, he plays out this scenario like he's a complementarian. So he believes that there's a distinction between the role of the husband and the role of the wife. And so he tells this story of like, what if the husband is like small, this little man, 5'1", like he can't lift, 10 pounds, right? But he's married to a karate champion wife, physically fit or whatever. And then here comes someone like about to rob them or whatever, but all they have is like their own fists, right? And like, there's that moment of, well, I gotta figure out what to do. Does the husband hide behind the wife, or the wife hide behind the husband? Like what is biblically this idea of complementarianism played out? And so he's like, what the husband still needs to do in that scenario is be willing to like take the first blow. It's right.
Yeah.
And I think, so I'm a complementarian. I think there's something there to that the husband always needs to be willing to protect the wife regardless of his own physical gifts. There's like this disposition towards protection, not because she's your property, but because you love her. And so you're going to do anything for her, including laying down your own life. And so, there's lots of things to talk about complementarianism, and like, that's a whole other podcast.
That's like solid biblical word. Like, we're called to reflect Christ, right? And he like laid down his life for us. And, as leaders and reflectors of that in our household, like I feel that calling on me too. So that's solid stuff. So risk. How do you prevent that person from attacking and robbing your house? Like, what is the level of, preparedness or precautions we think like our listeners should take?
Yeah. Cause we wanted to touch on risk at this point because some people can make the extreme of doing too much, and some people can make the extreme of doing too little. So I'm okay with the lock and key. Like, I'm okay with a fence in the backyard so that when my kids play, there's like a defined space. You know, and it's like, oh man, if we didn't have a fence between the yards, they could play with others. And then, yeah, they could also get attacked by the neighbor's dog. Like, you know, like there's different things. And I think we need to be very thoughtful in our consumeristic, individualistic society that we kind of really like the individual possession tax and we don't think about the sharing stuff. So we kind of worry too much about protecting our own rather than kind of having a disposition about, well, it's God's, like, let's not fret about whether or not we lose something. But yeah, thinking practically, like, I don't know. I don't worry too much. I'm okay with Google Chrome. I'm okay with multi-factor authentication. I'm okay with like kind of staying up to date on the news a bit and just understanding if there's things that I should worry about, then I'll want to worry about them. But I know I'm not the most important person in the world, so I know I'm not going to be hacked as much. I don't post any pictures of my kids online because of the threat of AI basically recreating their image and, you know, creating images of them online or things like that. Like, I don't like that. And not even just with AI. I just think I've talked about this before.
Yeah.
So I don't share personal stuff online. Like, I think that's one takeaway, that on that preventative level, like if you're sharing selfies in front of your own house online, like, yes, it's true that we used to live in a day where there was the yellow pages and anybody could look up anybody's address. So really, is it so bad to have your own house known online? It's just that there are evil people in the world. And so we just need to keep that in mind.
Like, it comes back to, I think the good question is like, yeah, would Jesus use security, right? Or I said, would Jesus use passwords? And I think if you take it back to Jesus in his day, you know, did Jesus use doors? Did Jesus use locking doors, right? Was his like door always open, right? Like, or he used the security of the society that he was in. You know, and as society progresses, like, you know, you talk about a shepherd protecting the sheep, it is wise to put up that fence to prevent the sheep from being bitten from the wolf, right? It's like, it is unwise to put the sheep in a precarious position that they might be, you know, snatched away. So there's wisdom in using security. Like, I believe God calls us, you know, as like shepherds of our home and of our like flock, and to take security seriously, right? And like be wise. And that is what a good and faithful servant would do, is like, you know, feel that call and then step up to the call and be like, well, at least like I need to do my due diligence of like researching and understanding like what I should do with this role that God has entrusted into me. And I think if you kind of like transport that as like technology goes on this evolution curve to today, it's like, yeah, the security that we have today is like, we might need a fence in our backyard. We might need more protections. We don't use the yellow pages anymore. We're not posting in front of our house because you could get doxxed. Depending on who you are, you might have like a swap party call to your house, right? Because you're getting doxxed online.
Regardless of where you are politically, it can happen to you.
Yeah. So I think like that is interesting nuance, is that as technology accelerates, we do need to keep up with the protections, right? And I think as much as it might seem disparaging or like hard to be like, hey, this is an arms race and it's like a never ending race. It's like, that's kind of our challenge, is like, we got to run the race, right? We got to keep going. And, one of the other advantages that is coming to mind is like, there will be specialists that can take some of this burden off of you, right? Like, we're using these tools, LastPass, 1Password. We don't have to have a piece of paper where we write down all our passwords that we can't remember, right? So I think it is okay as a concept to start outsourcing some of the security protections rather than, you know, having everything in your home. You might have a security company. You might have other equipment and other people involved. So I think that is like a natural aspect, that you will have security specialists that you kind of contract out that work to, for free, with ads, or for a price, or, you know, like different type of models for that.
Yeah, and talking to people in your church too, like outsourcing some of the knowledge gain to others in your own community and saying like, hey, what do you do for security? Like, just want to know, and that sort of thing. Like, I've seen at Costco, they're selling all these security camera stuff, and I'm like, Like it's one of those, oh man, in this crazy world, like a little bit of protection. I mean, that's in Canada, they sell security cameras. In the States, they sell guns, right? So like it's all about differences in context for security. We could get into the whole gun thing, right? Like should Christians own guns as security? Cause that's a whole other piece there that has been debated endlessly. Yeah. Some people defend do not murder, and they say that that is a proof text for owning a gun. Because you should use a gun to prevent someone from not murdering. And there is this kind of like, okay, well, wait, in the Old Testament, like justice was part of the Israelites were a nation state. And so there's a combination of political and, anyways. So in the New Testament, I see, like you see in Romans 14, like vengeance is to the Lord's, not to ours. So like, I don't think we should just be killing people who come into our home. But I'm not all anti just war. Like I believe there's some just wars we must fight. And so there might be some just fists we might need to throw. But anyways, that's just a little piece of a nugget that we might evaluate on a future episode on the technology of guns. But for now, we just need to wrap it up.
I think it's a big topic, and I think it deserves to be spoken about, because I think it's a tense topic, so not many people speak about it, right? Like they shy away from it. So I think, you know what, we're hearing it here. We will eventually put out an episode on, the technology of weapons. But even like you mentioned, like Israel today has like defense weapons against all of their enemies who are constantly firing rockets, right? And I think in terms of like, just to scratch the surface a bit, in terms of the US with like the militia and how the states became the United States and like all of these different things, there was this sort of like protect yourself from the government, and there was no government, right? So you had this militia, and like that has been enshrined in their First Amendment or Second Amendment rights, right? So I think, there's definitely a history to go to, and then like, well, what happens today, right? So anyways.
Yeah. No, it's like a TED Talk I watched years ago, and it's like, here are the 5 most important things you can do for a society in order to ensure that society will flourish. And like one of the 5 was personal property, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you don't have people getting a sense of ownership of their own property, then they won't take care of it. That's just proven. And here we have in God's wisdom, centuries, decades, millennia ago, saying, I will give you a land. Like, you're going to own this, Israel. You better take care of it. It's your land. Like, that's much of the narrative of the Old Testament. It revolves around them stewarding the land importantly. And we didn't even mention that word stewardship, but that's really what we're talking about. We need to steward the possessions that God has given us, steward the digital possessions that God has given us, steward ourselves and take care of ourselves, take care of our bodies and the bodies of our families, and really to care for, the things out of respect for the God of all things who has given them to us.
Yeah. So this has been enlightening. Very, very good for me to sit and reflect, right, on security. Because it's one of those things, I think it's like it either sounds boring or it's too complex, and we often don't talk about it. So it's been a long time coming, and I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, you did a good job of not being too boring. You did like drop some language that I'm like, I'm not going to remember that, Joel, but it felt like me sitting in some of the security meetings I did in the past for my role. But anyways, thank you, listeners for listening. And thank you for your support. As I said, like we're on the move as a podcast. We got guests coming up. Joel's finished reading. I was like, Joel, we got to read that book before we invite that guest. And Joel's he's like, I'm done that book. It's an awesome book. I have these takeaways. Like we're really excited about what's going on. I honestly see a huge gap right now in Christians thinking well about technology. I see some Christians who are just not following scripture in their teachings. There's like all sorts of just bad stuff out there that I'm realizing. And then there's others that are just take this blind, naive optimism, others that are just blind, naive pessimism. We need to think well. And it can't just happen in a book. It needs to be more live, like these podcasts are. Not doing just the news of yesterday, but the news of the last 6 months kind of thing is what we try to do, that we can think about some of those more meta topics. So thanks for your support. Really appreciate it. Go ahead, Joel.
No, yeah, I was just going to add, and you might want to cut this out and put it in Patreon only, but last week I was down in California, and I met a lot of Christians who were thinking about how they could create technology. So, we'll definitely have that in future podcasts. I think we'll start connecting a lot more of these pieces on like, this is a movement right now. And yeah, that'll be really exciting. So we'll get into that. Things are happening, get pumped.
Things are happening. Yeah. So thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. And if you want to keep supporting us, please do rate us on iTunes. Please follow us on our social media. Some of you follow us on just your podcast app, and that's awesome. But one of the things that help us grow is for more people to be made aware. And so simply by helping that algorithm out, by liking us on or subscribing on YouTube and then following on Twitter, or maybe we'll get a Facebook page because we've got some feedback that maybe we should. Or like, oh man, Facebook's so yesterday, but maybe we should do that. But yeah, no, we should probably we're professional podcasts now, even though we're just two amateurs trying to do our best. So thanks for listening. We just encourage you to use the technology that exists out there to secure your digital and physical possessions, but find rest. Do not find your ultimate hope in the security of these pieces of tech, but find your security and rest in God, and ultimately do everything to glorify Him. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care.
Bye.